Places in the Park, St. Louis Park, presented by Bill Beyer. St. Louis Park was named by real estate speculators, shaped by railroads, and the subject of a huge social experiment by one of the world's richest men. St. Louis Park has stories to tell. Bill Beyer, retired architect, park resident for 36 years, and trustee of the St. Louis Park Historical Society, will highlight the city's founding and early history. Welcome, Bill. Thank you.
Can't start without a blatant commercial pitch for our two books, copies of which I have tonight, if you want to purchase one. Places in the Park is a book we put together in sort of a hurry in 2019 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Milwaukee Road Depot being named to the National Register of Historic Places in St. Louis Park. 2 years later, the St. Louis Park Historical Society was founded, and the depot was moved about 200 yards to the west to Jorvig Park, where it resides today. It's underutilized because there are no public toilets anywhere near it, and it's hard to get people in there and out of there in groups. But we have a plan for that, and we'll talk about that a little at the end. So I'll just jump right into the history of St. Louis Park. In 1841, the Federal Preemption Act allowed squatters to settle 160 acres of land before it was formally surveyed. In St. Louis Park, the first surveys west of the Mississippi were filed around 1860. So before 1860, you could stake out your 160 acres of land and improve it by building a house and get it for $1.25 an acre when it came up formally and it was platted and surveyed. The 1841 Act allocated 500,000 acres to the states for public improvements of roads and waterways, and specifically for the draining of the swamps. And I colored up this 1901 USGS map of the park to show where the swamps were back then, and a squint test will tell you that half the city was a swamp. A lot of it has been filled in. Obviously, the north half of the city, you couldn't tell that anymore, that it was always wet. But we've improved it. St. Louis Park has some odd configuration going on. Golden Valley took a bite out of the northeast corner of it. The village of Morningside, which finally joined Edina sometime in the 70s, I think, took a bigger bite out of the southeast corner. And Harley Hopkins, who actually preempted 160 acres in 1854, took a huge bite out of the southwest corner. We got our revenge, I think in 1950s sometime, when we took a bite out of Minnetonka. So we're on balance, we're still short a few hundred acres. But the other interesting thing about St. Louis Park is that this is one of the prime meridians in the surveying system. And east of that line, the land was surveyed out of St. Paul, and west of that line, the land was surveyed out of Dubuque, Iowa. So you can see little bumps where Minnetonka Boulevard is offset and where the city limits are offset. I think it's about 200 feet, 300 feet, based on the fact that the surveys really didn't match very well. So we have weird boundaries, and I think it's safe to say that history can be an accident, and we prove it. The railroads came through around 1867 into 1872 or so. The northern third of the city was cut off by the Great Northern, James J. Hill's big experiment in getting to the coast in a hurry. And the south was cut off by two railroads, the Minneapolis and St. Louis, followed by the Milwaukee Road a few years later. And they somehow got trackage side by side. And the Great Northern had no interest at all in serving local farmers. So the reason that the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad was even started by people like the founders of General Mills and Charles Pillsbury and the like was so that local merchants would actually be served by the railroads. And consequently, a couple of depots were built in St. Louis Park. But Harley Hopkins got there first in 1871. The Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad was going right through the middle of his land, and he was fairly shrewd. Instead of asking for money, he traded his land for a depot in Hopkins with his name on it and being named the postmaster of the post office there. So 17 years before St. Louis Park was actually a village, Harley Hopkins sort of preempted the whole commercial idea of railroads in some ways. So you can see a little bit here where Excelsior Boulevard comes on its old alignment, its current alignment. So that's one of the fossil streets we'll talk about as I get down the road a little bit. The two depots in St. Louis Park, the top one is the Milwaukee Road Depot, which was built in about 1887. And the bottom one is the Minneapolis and St. Louis Depot that was built a couple years later. Or earlier, I think. The Minneapolis and St. Louis Depot burned down in 1967, I think. So these two were only a couple hundred yards apart. So you had a lot of railroad service in one spot. Around 1890, a few years after St. Louis Park became a village in 1886. Thomas B. Walker and his real estate buddies in the city of Minneapolis had a grand scheme to create an industrial town similar to Pullman, Illinois. Apparently Walker knew Pullman and had toured the company town that Pullman built in Chicago, and thought that this was the perfect place to locate industry in that would serve Minneapolis primarily, as opposed to St. Paul. He had just lost a huge fight with the city of St. Paul when Minneapolis tried to annex the Midway district for the same purpose, but lost out. So St. Louis Park was the fallback position for industry. And he bought up close to 3 square miles of the city or the village, everything really between Minnetonka Boulevard and Excelsior Boulevard on the south. You can see the railroads going through, and right in the middle of it, he created what he was calling his industrial circle. And it's like a railroad roundabout that served multiple industrial sites. On Unfortunately, not unfortunately, in those days you put industrial uses on the less desirable land, the lowlands. So he built his industrial circle on what was called, at that point, the Great Swamp. The railroad had already sliced off a chunk of the Great Swamp south of the city, but this whole area in gray was pretty much wetland when Walker decided to create industry there. These are a couple of lovely old photos from 1910 looking west, and you can see the incredible amount of fill required to get the railroad across the swamp. That's close to 20 feet vertical rise on the Minneapolis and St. Louis tracks. And Walker actually was very successful in attracting industry to this area. On the right is the first big catch that he got, which was the Monitor Drill Company. They had invented a machine to plant corn. Apparently it drilled it into the ground. That's all I can imagine. And that brought 300 jobs to the city. He poached the Esterly Farm Equipment Company from Whitewater, Wisconsin, and got them to move to St. Louis Park. It's a sizable piece of real estate there. And they brought, I believe, 500 jobs to the park. So the population of St. Louis Park was about 400 in 1890, and in 1900 it was 1,300. And a lot of those new residents were people who lived in houses that Walker built to house them along the Pullman theory. So that was about 1890 to 1892. It took the surveyor 2 years to replat 3 square miles of wrong button. 3 square miles of St. Louis Park. And at the time, the county assessor said it was the largest survey ever filed in the state. As luck would have it for T.B. Walker, right after he filed his plat and started luring industry to the city, the Panic of 1893 hit him like a train. And the Monitor Drill Company was closed for months at a time. I think Esterly shut down for a while and maybe ran a skeleton crew. A lot of railroads went out of business, and everything really stalled. So Walker was left with 3 square miles of unsold property that he had to pay taxes on. And the legend has it that it almost bankrupted him, but he managed to squeak through, I think, somehow. 1894, of course, the Pullman strike in Chicago turned very violent and had to be shut down by federal troops. So I think Walker had second thoughts about the whole idea of a company town controlled by him. So maybe he dodged a bullet there. T.B. Walker himself had started out he was the classic Minnesota rags to riches story. He came to town about 1860, hired on as a chain man on a surveying crew, which was the lowest rank, if you would. He had very little money. And he traveled around the Midwest surveying property, much of it the northern timberlands in Minnesota. He spent all of his money optioning and buying up timberland for a number of years, and it made him very quickly very rich. In 1874, he started collecting art. The upper right photo was his living room, I think, downtown. And then, of course, I think you might have heard of the Walker Art Center, which he built. And these are the multiple iterations of Walker. I think I didn't see the Moorish one, but I saw the others. And, of course, in 1971, Ed Barnes did a magnificent job. And this is the most recent addition to the Walker. So, obviously, he came through the 1893 troubles without too much trouble in the end. As I think I've read, he ended up as about the 10th richest man in the world in 1928 when he died. That would be comparable to Bill Gates today, about $100 billion worth of wealth. So he did pretty well in his land speculation. Unfortunately for St. Louis Park, at least I say it because I'm a beer lover, T.B. Walker and Harriet were absolute teetotaling Methodists. So it was claimed that he was going to shut down everything that he had built for industry if the city didn't stay dry. So on our website, we have great stories about how St. Louis Park went wet and dry by like 5 votes every 2 years for decades, it seems. But that was one of his legacies. All was not lost. In 1916, the Republic Creosote Company moved from downtown Minneapolis on the riverfront to the site just north of, this was the Walker Railroad roundabout. By the time of this aerial photo, Highway 7 had been blasted right through the middle of it. But this was the Republic Creosote property, and they, although Monitor Drill, which was right about here, I think, closed in 1929 and merged with Minneapolis Moline in Hopkins. So they abandoned their gigantic plant, and it burned down, I think, about 1930. Republic Creosote became the largest employer in the park and stayed that way till about 1970 when it closed. But on the upside, we got the title of our book, Something in the Water, from all of the coal tar derivatives that they dumped into the swamp that seeped into the groundwater that we still have to treat today and probably will have to treat for the next 100 years. So there's an upside to everything, I guess. Other industries actually came along as well later. This is a view from the intersection of what's now I-394 and Highway 100 looking south. And on the horizon, you can see the 3 tallest buildings are all along the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad track in St. Louis Park, and they are the grain elevators that were there. I think the most recent one was removed in the 80s or 90s. The one on the left exploded in the biggest fire in the city's history in 1977, I think. Ted might remember better than that. And the middle one is now the site of Nordic Wear on Highway 7. But there's nothing much else to see except 3 gigantic industrial properties on the horizon in that case. So now I want to talk a little bit about fossil roads, which is something I just invented for this talk. So I classify Excelsior Boulevard as a fossil road because it was actually Territorial Road number 3 that the legislature funded improvement for in 1849, 9 years before Minnesota became a state. And it really has always been the heart and soul of St. Louis Park. Walker made a mistake. He tried to locate a new downtown right near his industrial circle, and it really never took. He built a lovely 2-story building of brick that is still there today, and across the street, the mayor built a lovely 2-story building of brick, and they were done about 1895, and after that, it was nothing, pretty much. No commercial activity on Main Street. Excelsior Boulevard continued to thrive all those years, mainly because it went somewhere. Went to Excelsior and then to Glencoe. It was the Glencoe Road originally. So when you drive Excelsior Boulevard and you take all these jogs, you're traveling on one of the oldest tracks in the state. The other one here is Wooddale Avenue. Now, Wooddale has been named at least 4 different things, Pleasant Avenue and one other name I can't remember, but it was also called the Schoolhouse Road because St. Louis Park, if it was serious about anything, it was serious about its schools. So the Pratt School was built in 1859 on Excelsior Boulevard, and Wooddale Avenue was created by Jonathan Grimes, who, this is my tie-in to Linden Hills. Jonathan, of course, pretty much owned all of the land in Morningside, and then he also bought land across France Avenue. I think that's Linden Hills, but the Sunnyside Nursery, I think, was on the site of his nursery. He became a state-famed horticulturist in his old age, and I think Sunnyside is just about where his nursery was located. But his kids had no place to go to school except Pratt, and if you remember the slide of the swamp went right through there and between his house on 44th Street, which is still there and is on the National Register of Historic Places, and Pratt School. There was, along 42nd Street, a formidable wetland. So he actually graded the road. He created Wooddale Avenue from 44th to Pratt so his kids could walk to school. The mayor, Joseph Hamilton, who owned a 120-acre farm up north, decided that he would grade the other part of the road to Pratt from his farm so that his kids could walk to school, presumably. So the 100% corner of St. Louis Park was there because Pratt School was there.
Could you show where France is?
Pardon?
Could you show where France runs?
Right. I would say France is right here. That's France Avenue. So I can't ever remember what year this plat was from, but it's in the 1890s, I think. So anyway, you got 2 roads that if you're ever on them, unfortunately, when Highway 100 blew through right across the intersection pretty much, it cut Wooddale into 2 pieces, and now there's no continuity. You really don't have any idea that it was a road that went somewhere at one time. The schools, Pratt School, this, I believe, was the second Pratt School on the same site. It was built in 1860 1946 after the first one burned down, but it took them months to build a new school because it was really the community center for St. Louis Park as much as anything else. There were no churches at that point. You could meet in a barn, but you had a school. That was it. In 1890, the village flexed its brand new 4-year-old muscles and built a substantial 3-story, 2-story, I'd say it's 2.5-story stone building that housed the new high school. The park was growing fast enough that it needed a high school. It was the Lincoln School, it was called. And they also allotted space in an addition that they did a couple of years later for the village hall. So that was the center of park education.
Where was that school located?
About 37th and Alabama, where the industrial place that moved out is located now. You wouldn't know it. It's been gone since, I think, the 60s or 50s when a new city hall was built for the park. And then in 1914, they had outgrown even Lincoln School, which was filling up with younger kids by then. So they built a brand new high school to save on taxes. T.B. Walker donated all the land to the city, and that was built in 1914. And this photo was taken, I believe, in 1937 by a high school senior named Margaret Fornell, who went on to an interesting career in journalism, but she climbed to the top of the brand new St. Louis Park water tower to take it. She's only 5 feet tall, but she got a good view. And this is 1937, and pretty amazing how empty everything is, even in 1937.
Is that the same location that the high school is now?
That's the same location that Central, which was the high school, then the junior high, is now. Sadly, this building, which was quite elegant, was torn down and replaced in the 60s by a pretty nasty, low-ceilinged brick box that I still hate. But
and what's the street in the foreground?
I'm sorry?
What is the street in the foreground?
Wooddale.
Well, this is actually Brunswick, I think. Wooddale is over here a little bit. This is Dakota Avenue, I believe, right along the edge. Our offices are right on this corner in a building that didn't exist yet.
Is that the train tracks going across?
That's Highway 7, and actually, when they built Highway 7, they built a tunnel underneath it for the students to cross Highway 7, and it apparently was a nasty little dark affair that was probably 6.5 feet high and 4 feet wide. And they actually dug it up when they improved the Wooddale intersection a few years back and filled it in, but nobody wanted to use the tunnel because it was just ugly. So, but yeah, that's Highway 7. So yeah, that would have been brand new when Margaret climbed the water tower. The new high school, the existing high school, or today's high school, is back over here. This was to be the main street of St. Louis Park, and you can see something I'm going to talk about in the future, the St. Louis Park State Bank, right across the street from the high school. Speaking of which, the only thing that we have left of the St. Louis Park State Bank is this incredible photo. The bank was founded in 1915. by a guy named Roy Quimby, and it was bankrupt in 1919 and was never used as a bank again, but it did house the post office for a while, and some entrepreneur bought it up and used it as a snack shop for the high school students across the street. Apparently did pretty well. Like I said, the photo is just magnificent. It's a rare thing in our collection that, we seldom have photos this classy of anything. But when I discovered this, I think I've been around the society for 6 years or so. When I found this photo, it rang a bell for me as an architect. I swore I had seen a building that looked exactly like it somewhere. The story of the demise of the St. Louis Park State Bank was on the pages of the Star Tribune actually it was the Tribune in 1919 when the state bank examiner swooped in and shut it down, along with a dozen other banks across the state that had been founded by Roy Quimby. He had apparently touted himself as the person who owned more banks than anybody in the United States, but he basically found a scheme where he was able to found banks and then loot them. And in this case, in August of 1918, he sold his string of 13 banks across the state to another slick operator named Billy Schaefer. Well, Billy Schaefer got caught holding the bag, and he was arrested for fraud and extortion and everything else, and eventually convicted and sent to Stillwater for 1 to 10 years of hard labor. But his trial was a real circus. Turns out he had a mistress who lived in Chicago, but who had been a famous Minneapolis showgirl on the stage on Hennepin Avenue. So she was brought from Chicago to testify, and they were looking for money in her Chicago apartment and didn't find any. Billy Schaefer was well enough off to hire Clarence Darrow as part of his legal team. So, and Clarence Darrow was famous even then in 1918. For those of you who don't know the name, about 3 years later, he was the defense attorney in the Scopes monkey trial, which really made him famous around the world. But the bank photo rang a bell, and I swore that I had driven past a building that looked just like it. And in fact, in Frontenac, Minnesota, right on Highway 61, at least the last time I checked, the building is still there. It's vacant. And then I remembered the name of the book, whose name I always forget, but it was David Gebhardt and Tom Martinson's book on the history of Minnesota architecture, and that reminded me that Marina and St. Croix had a bank that looked just like it, and those two banks were featured in the Gebhardt and Martinson book. So then I got real interested and started looking. This is down the rabbit hole by now. And I discovered that Quimby had started banks in Waconia, Hamel, Cologne, Chanhassen, St. Louis Park, Augusta, Longsiding, Frontenac, Marine, Skyburg, Tower, Minnesota, up on the range, and St. Bonifacius. So there were a dozen banks, and they were almost all identical to the St. Louis Park State Bank. The first couple were not. I traveled out to Cologne a couple summers ago, and I got a The lady who put together their centennial booklet pointed out to me that the State Bank in Cologne was actually the renovation of a double-wide house that was owned by the vice president of the bank. So they did that one on the cheap, but behind the cheesy vinyl siding, you can still see the pressed metal cornice and dentils that were gussying it up to make it a commercial property while the house next door stayed the house next door. It's still a double-wide house these days. So then this was early in COVID, I got on Google Maps and did the street views, and I found the bank in Long Siding, one in Augusta, one in St. Bonifacius that were still there. And they are as close to identical as you could imagine. There are 5 or 6 of the banks that actually are gone now, torn down. And the first one, Quimby actually bought a bank that had been owned by a bank. So they moved out into bigger space, and he just moved right in with his first bank in Waconia. In Hamel, he sort of started flirting with Greek revival. I'm not sure, this is the only image I've been able to find of Hamel. I'm not sure if it's original or not, of the original configuration, but bank in Skyburg, the bank in Tower, and the bank in Chanhassen are, again, identical to the St. Louis Park State Bank. All gone now, but I could find photos. Skyburg doesn't exist anymore at all. Hamel barely exists. It's sort of a sub-part of whatever the town north of Plymouth is. Yeah. And then the last really elegant Greek revival front was in a town called New Prairie, Minnesota. Now, you probably haven't heard of New Prairie because it was a flag stop on the Northern Pacific between Starbuck and Morris. So it was barely a thing in 1916 or 1917 when Roy established the bank there, and it has completely disappeared now. I had no idea. I mean, there's just nothing there anymore. But this story is where I sort of thought it had a lot of fun. The people in front of the window there are Wendell Peterson and his new bride, Donna Peterson, got married after World War II. And he surprised her one day and drove her out to New Prairie, which was barely there, and said that he had bought the bank and that he was going to dismantle it and use it to build their dream house in the booming town of Terrace, Minnesota. Now, Terrace may be the only town in Minnesota that the railroads missed. And amazingly, almost the entire town is on the National Register of Historic Places, put on there in the 80s, I think. My wife and I drove out there just to see what it was about. And I stood in the middle of the main road for 45 minutes taking pictures and never saw a car. So that's how obscure Terrace, Minnesota is. But Wendy and Donna did build their dream house on the mill pond in Terrace, Minnesota. And as you can see, the leaded glass transoms were a lovely addition to their kitchen, and they look out over the pond. All those big pieces of plate glass up above apparently form the corner of their dining room, so they have wraparound views of the place they both grew up. So the thing I learned there is that the local historical societies from around the state are just gold mines of people who want to help and who have knowledge of things you just can't imagine. So I couldn't have put any of this together without the help of people in Tower and Pope County and Carver County and Washington County, all the people who sort of guided me through the story of all these bizarre old banks. I was at our office over the weekend and made a discovery. We had an aerial photo from the Minnesota Historical Society that I had never seen in the 6 years of rummaging through our files. So I added it to the presentation. And it's a view looking over the Monitor Drill Company buildings of exactly 100 years ago, 1922. Looking east, here are the railroad tracks that slice through the MS&L. There's the high school looking from the other side. These are the two buildings that comprise downtown St. Louis Park for 50 years. A building that Tom T.B. Walker built, the Walker Building, and the building that the mayor built, the Hamilton Building. And they were called the Brick Block, and they were supposed to be the seeds for downtown. You know, you can see the bank. It's still there. And amazingly, the only three buildings in our city that are left from pre-1900 other than houses are the Walker Building, which is right there, the P.V. Haglund Experimental Grain Elevator, which is also on the National Register, and is right there in the background. You can barely see it. And the Milwaukee Road Depot, which I can barely see it. I think it's right about there. So I was able to find a photo that captured all the three buildings I was going to talk about of what remains of St. Louis Park before 1900.
What's in the foreground?
That's the Monitor Drill Company buildings 7 or 8 years before they burned them to the ground. At least that was the first T.B. Walker industrial concern that came to his circle, the industrial circle. You can't see it, but the spur comes off and goes around like that. So there's a lot of information in this photo.
Which direction are you?
Looking east, actually Highway 7 would come right through the middle of the picture 15 years later. Yeah, looking east, there's nothing above the horizon. You can't see the IDS building or anything. But you might, and you couldn't see the Fauché Tower either because that was 1929. But it was a good find, a lucky find for a Saturday. This is a diagram, a map from our book that shows the Highway 7 and Louisiana interchange overlaid on the Walker's industrial circle. Here's the, we hope, new Southwest Light Rail station at Louisiana. Highway 7, of course. And then we got three roundabouts, and the northern roundabout pretty much follows the line of Walker Street as it looped around the north edge of T.B. Walker's industrial circle. So there's so many interesting stories that I'm sure I'll never run out of them. But that's it for my presentation, and happy to take any questions.
So if
About
anybody
45 minutes.
has a question? Thank you. That was just fascinating.
So, Bill, if you wanted to go downtown on the train, you had two choices. You could, and so did they both go downtown? It was just a matter of when you wanted to leave is what you chose, or how did that work?
Yeah, when I think both Milwaukee Road and MS&L Road ran passenger service to downtown Minneapolis. So up until 1954, I think the Milwaukee Road did it. So interestingly enough, we get Southwest Light Rail coming right through on the M&SL right-of-way, 70 years later. And maybe we'll get, if they can find $500 million, we'll finally have Southwest Light Rail. I forgot to mention another fossil road, which is, you see that dark line in the background? That is Lake Street, which runs at a 45-degree angle from Minnetonka Boulevard and Highway 100 right down to the center of the Walker Industrial Circle. D.B. Walker platted that, and in 1892, he built an electric trolley car that went from Hennepin and Lake and connected into the city system and ran all the way down to what was supposed to be downtown St. Louis Park and all the jobs for the industrial circle. And that, 1895, he actually extended it all the way to Hopkins along Lake Street and then Excelsior Boulevard. But he was stopped by, he couldn't get permission to cross the rail track in Hopkins, so he got stopped on 6th Street, I think, in downtown. But Lake Street is another, I'd call him a fossil street, because it wouldn't have ever been there if anybody with a grid had ever platted the city of St. Louis Park. But we have all these angled streets and funny lots because Walker wanted a straight line as close to his downtown as he could get.
Go ahead.
Any?
Where did the streetcar to Excelsior run?
Well, that came along 1904. I think the service to Hopkins was discontinued about then because the guy Thomas Lowry, who built the big Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company, bought Walker's line. He actually operated it to St. Louis Park until 1938, not to Hopkins, but that's where Linden Hills comes in, because the Como-Harriet line was extended in 1904 and 05 to take people out to Lake Minnetonka, which was the resort destination of the Midwest. And of course, they went right through the middle of nowhere. There was nothing in Edina at the time, and nothing in their way in Hopkins, and until they got to the railroad tracks, and they had to build a lovely viaduct over the tracks that came down into downtown Hopkins. So sometime in the next few months, I'll be having an article in Hennepin History magazine talking about that one. But that's when Walker couldn't really get past the rail lines, but they had enough land to go up and over them to the south.
Got a question right over here.
The Minneapolis and St. Louis goes to Peoria, and the Milwaukee Road goes to Seattle. How far west do the lines diverge?
Not far. Like in Hopkins, I think. The MS&L, I believe, heads south to Carver at that point, and the Milwaukee Road goes everywhere, I think. There are so many places that these railroads bought.
So roughly at the depot in Hopkins would have been where the two lines would have diverged, and then they would run side by side from there into Minneapolis?
Pretty much, yeah. An interesting story on the Milwaukee Road line. It started out as the Hastings and Dakota Milwaukee Road bought it at some point. For a while, they ran their trains on the MS&L tracks through St. Louis Park, but then MS&L agreed to sell them adjacent right-of-way. And the Milwaukee Road built a big rail yard just south of Highway 7 in a swamp, Bass Lake, basically. And they built it with the fill from depressing their line across South Minneapolis that's currently the Crosstown Greenway. those were all at-grade crossings in 1910 until the Milwaukee Road lowered the railroad 20 feet and built all those bridges. And they took all that fill and pushed it into St. Louis Park and made a big rail yard for themselves. I think one of the earlier slides might have even showed that. So,
We've got a question here.
yeah, this was the beginning of the rail yard.
Who named St. Louis Park and why?
Well, the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad named St. Louis Park. In our files, we have a manuscript that was produced by a history grad student in 1952, I think, Norman Thomas. And he pointed out that the St. Louis Park Land and Investment Company was established 6 months before the village of St. Louis Park was established and named. And that was, the principals of that were the people who owned the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railway. So basically, we got our name from land speculators who never lived in the park. Yes?
Can you tell us about the remnant of old Lilac Park that's now known as Rock Island?
Right. There were a couple of wayside parks that were built as part of Highway 100 in the mid-1930s. And you might have seen some of the beehive stone structures, one of which was relocated to the south side of Highway 7, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago by the city of St. Louis Park. They're still behind the sound wall north of Minnetonka Boulevard. There are the remnants of the original wayside park with rock sculptures and, pools and bridges and unmaintained really for, 50 years or longer. And I think the city council is likely to preserve at least those physical parts of Rock Island Park, but they haven't decided yet. So that's all I know.
Isn't Walker buried over in Lakeview? Big monument there.
Yeah, somewhere. A lot of people are buried in Lakewood Cemetery. But, well, that's where all the movers and shakers ended up. But
Maybe another question or two, if we have any other.
any other questions? I'm on a roll, I think. So.
What a great presentation. That was terrific.